Hi, I'm Dave Thomas, Director of Content Marketing at CDK, and here with me is Elizabeth Krear. Welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So today we're going to talk about electric vehicles. You were the head of electric vehicle practice at JD Power.
Yep.
It has been a crazy year, and it's not even February 1st yet.
That's right.
So I think what everyone is paying attention to is Washington, D.C., and the idea that not only are $7,500 incentives going to go away, but the infrastructure was also specifically mentioned from day one of this new administration. So what do you think is going to happen in the next year with these moves supposedly coming down the road?
Yeah, let's start with that infrastructure. Infrastructure is not keeping up with demand. There's a lot of reliability issues. In fact, among the EV owners that we talk to, public charging availability is the least satisfying aspect of owning an EV. So when I think about the influence that the NEVI funds, or maybe if they pull them back, could have on infrastructure, I think, well, they haven't really been helping to date, right? We see the Tesla network scoring much better with consumers. We don't see necessarily the investments in infrastructure meeting consumer requirements yet. In fact, the satisfaction has gone down every single year for 5 years straight.
Wow.
So it's not only is it the least satisfying aspect, but it continues to degrade because the number of EVs on the road are increasing at 2 times the pace of the infrastructure growth. So I'm not quite sure that the solution is there short term for the consumer, other than the most satisfying aspect of owning an EV, which you could probably finish my sentence, home charging.
Right, never having to go to the gas station.
Exactly, waking up to a full charge. So I think what's going to happen is the short-term runway until infrastructure can catch up is really going to be having that conversation with the customer and understanding what are your driving habits. Do you have an ability to charge at home?
Right.
Do you have an ability to charge at work? You know, and it's going to be a unique situation for everyone. Do you have a second car in your household where maybe you can split that difference until infrastructure can catch up?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been covering EVs since the first Leaf came out, and that car could only go 80 miles, so it had to be a second. There was no choice. It's like it's a second car. But even today, I always say, they should still just keep marketing to people that own 2 cars, which is still the majority of Americans.
Exactly.
But it seems to be this fixation on maximum range, and for some reason the idea of the road trip really hangs people up, that they can't do a road trip the way they want to.
Well, and that again is that education, and really having the conversation. And I'm sure we'll get into it when we talk about the other piece of the incentive that could go away, which is that tax incentive on the car, but the total cost of ownership discussion.
Right, I mean, with energy prices, gas is actually not going down, so it continues to be a better deal over time to go EV, to go electric. So let's talk about that $7,500 going away. After November, the writing was on the wall, and sales in December were the strongest ever for EVs. Clearly, people made the decision and pulled up demand. They made the decision in December to buy the EV, thinking that they're going to lose that opportunity. If the $7,500 does go away, where do you think the impact's going to be? Do you think it's going to be an immediate drop in sales, or do you think it's going to be kind of slow pace? What do you think?
Yeah, I think 2 things happen in December. One, December is always a month where we do see a little bit of a spike. It's the end of the year. A lot of premium sales happen in December. There's a lot of EVs available for the premium buyers. So naturally, the last couple of years, we've seen EV sales increase in December. But 10.5%, to your point, the highest the industry has ever seen. 1 out of 10 shoppers bought an EV, more than 1 out of 10. So we definitely saw something there, and I think it's such a big decision to buy an electric vehicle. What could have happened is, number one, the natural spike that we see in December, and then number two, those folks that, hey, I've been thinking about this anyway. There's some really good deals going on right now, and I get that incentive.
Yeah, and it was in the headlines a lot. Right.
Yes.
It was a talking point. So you
It
really
was a
couldn't-
talking point.
Really couldn't escape it. And I always think that EVs get an outsized share of conversation than where they are. But this idea that we don't need incentives is something that dealers generally like. They want an even playing field. Let the market decide. You hear that phrase a lot without incentives. Where does it in the future, once we get past whatever changes, what's the regular life of EVs as a market share going forward?
So this is a really interesting question, because you heard me just talk about the total cost of ownership, right? The cost of gasoline, cost of electricity, incentives. These are, this isn't the way a consumer necessarily thinks when they're at the dealership.
Right.
When they're at the dealership, it's very much that transaction price. And so on one hand, I think the total cost of ownership is incredibly important because it could bridge that gap. But let's talk about that transaction price, because in the last 2 years, it actually has come down. The month of November, the transaction price to buy a full battery electric vehicle on average for the entire industry was $1,000 less than the average transaction price to buy a non-BEV. Now, when I say non-BEV, that means gasoline, hybrid, and plug-in hybrid.
Interesting.
Remember, hybrids and plug-in hybrids tend to be a bit more expensive. But so the industry finally got there in November with transaction prices, and I can tell you in rank order what closed that gap, because I mean that's a $20,000 delta from 2 years ago. What closed the gap is, in rank order, number one, OEM dealer incentives, number two, the federal incentive, and then number three, a mix shift. So a lot of EVs that have been out in the market for a couple of years now and launched very rich, we're starting to see them come down to lower price classes. So finally the industry has kind of closed that gap. If the federal incentive goes away, a third of it comes back. There's going to be a $5,700 gap that somebody's going to have to cover. Could it all be covered in operating cost, or dealer OEM going to have to kick in?
Okay, I think we're going to be good. I think the dance party is turning before it comes our way. So, but I want to stay on track. And
this
talk
is New
about,
Orleans. There's going to be
there's a party.
There's going to be interruptions.
Party in the aisle. So, talking about the product mix. Last year, I've been saying this for a long time, that there just simply aren't a lot of EVs for people to choose from, right? I mean, this year alone, just 2 EVs, the Honda Prologue and the Chevy Equinox EV came out, and they shot up to the top of the charts.
They sure did.
Besides Tesla. And that's, people have been waiting, especially Honda buyers who are so loyal. So do you think product mix has got to improve? There's got to be more variety. I mean, VW's got a bus, which, is kind of unique, but it's unique. We don't have a lot of 3-row EVs out there. We also don't have a lot of affordable EVs, but how much does that mix have to improve before they become, what any buyer can go look at?
I'm so glad you asked this question, because this to me is one of the insights that happened last year that I think addresses exactly what you're talking about. It's the chicken and the egg. Do you build them and they will come, or do we need to have more demand before we build them? Last year, we talk about market scope. You're talking about market scope. There was no mid-size mainstream SUV until last year with the Prologue Blazer. Equinox came to market at the right price, right? At $31,000 transaction, $32,000. So finally, mainstream had some choices. We call that market scope. A year ago, the market, I should say market coverage. The market coverage for a shopper in the mainstream category was only 35%, meaning there were so many gaps. This past year, it jumped up to 59% for mainstream. Premium has been at about 82%. So now that consumers for 1 year in the mainstream have had a good coverage at 60%, we actually saw mainstream franchise growth grow 58% last year. So even though the EV industry only grew 10%, Tesla was down 5%, and mainstream franchise was up 58%.
Wow.
So to your point, there needs to be selection. 3-row SUVs, there's a couple, there's more on the horizon.
Right. Yeah, we're going to talk about Tesla in a minute, but since we talked about it, when I look at what's coming, next year, so everyone, a big point keeps being the affordability. We need an affordable one. I'm not sold on that. I think with the way EVs are priced, you need to have a buyer that's used to paying a certain amount to kind of move up to pay a little bit more for an EV. So next year, I mean, the new EVs coming out, there's pretty much just one that is that affordable. It's from Kia, they're planning to put out an affordable one. Otherwise, you have a Jeep Wagoneer. That's not going to be inexpensive. You have the VW Bus we talked about, the Hyundai 3-row EV, that's like the Kia, the sister vehicle to that. So, they seem kind of aimed at not the budget, but to kind of hit a market where they might want to pay that extra money. And we see average transaction prices are always so high, yada, yada. But do you think that's the right type of mix, or do you think there should be more on that affordability side?
Well, I think that the compact SUV, you're talking about 3 rows, always going to carry more of a I don't want to say necessarily premium, but just by the nature of the vehicle, it's going to be larger, it's going to be more expensive. Something with the name of a Wagoneer in front of it is going to be more expensive. The iconic VW Buzz, right now, with all that anticipation, I think they actually have really low days to turn, by the way. I think it was something like 39 days to turn. So there's a pent-up demand. Maybe they'll bring some of those lower trim mixes down. But when you talk about the affordable EVs, that compact SUV segment that has been pretty rich with choices, the EV6, the Ioniq 5, the ID4, the Mach-E, the Equinox, there's a lot of product in that segment, and that's where we saw those prices really coming down. And you want to know I know we're going to talk about Tesla in a minute, but you want to know who's fueling that is when the Model Y lowers the price by $25,000.
Compete.
It definitely has ripple effects on those types of vehicles.
I mean, Tesla, and let's get into Tesla. They are the originator and still the outlier in a way. It's kind of interesting. They have dipped below 50% of market share. They're one of only 2 automakers in 24 that did not see a sales gain in the US, and Stellantis was the other one. And talk about headlines, there's always a negative headline last year about Stellantis, not so much about Tesla, despite their slowdown. We just the other day, yesterday, I can't keep track of my days, Model Y refresh kind of pops up with a higher price. And I don't really want to think about the CEO of the company, but it's clearly a driver of things. Yeah. What's going to happen with Tesla this year?
Well, Tesla owned the market for so long, right? A few years ago, I'm thinking even as short as 3.5, 4 years ago, the split was 80-20. 80% of every vehicle EV sold was Tesla. During that same time frame, the industry went from 22 EV models, some of them so small that the typical buying public couldn't resonate with them. So it really was just a Tesla market and a couple other players, but to 58 models today. Right. So that market scope again. And so that what's happened is Tesla now, 2 things have happened. One, overall the EV market share has grown, but it's been fueled by the franchise. The split is, from a volume standpoint, the split is 50-50.
Right.
I mean, mainstream and premium franchises selling about 600,000, Tesla's selling about 600,000. So we're going to see more competition. With competition breeds sometimes value, and really, like you talk about the refresh, if mainstream has all these refresh vehicles and Tesla's not refreshing, consumers are going to start looking at those new products.
Yeah. I find it one of the interesting things about Tesla is they don't follow the traditional model cycle, 3-year refresh, 6-year new model. And so, one, every Tesla on the road looks the same, so it kind of has this like mass effect, like there's just, that there's so many of them because there's no variety, they all look the same. But I think that's, when you see traditional automakers, and we'll talk about the Chinese in another second, but when you see the traditional automakers say, we're going to take our traditional way of refreshing 3 years, improving, making new headlights look cooler, and do what they usually do, that's a lot of competition coming from a dozen, 20 different automakers aimed at Tesla. So it is a unique thing. And Tesla, I don't know if they're going to be able to handle that.
Well, there's a big advantage that Tesla has, and that's that supercharger network.
That's true.
That is a big advantage, and they've opened it up though. They've opened it up. Now, even though they've opened it up, automakers have to make software changes, hardware changes. They need the right adapters,
Right.
and so and there's a working with Tesla to bring them in one at a time. But Tesla owners, right from the get-go, have that advantage.
Yeah.
The Tesla truck. That has a different style than the
That is
rest of the
different.
Teslas. And, it outsold the F-150 Lightning.
It did.
I mean, they're not really, they're both trucks, but they are going to attract a very different kind of buyer.
I mean, say what you want, but I don't think there's a vehicle you could buy that stands out more on the road.
No.
I mean, even the Hummer, which is actually a terrific vehicle in its own, I don't think stands out like the Cybertruck.
The Hummer was really interesting. The GMC, and just fueled by the Hummer brand, they increased sales last year 419%. Now I know when you only
numbers.
sell
Right.
4,000 and now you sell 16,000, but
Right.
$1.6 billion consumers spent on Hummer EVs.
It's a blast. It is a blast. Like when you hit the gas and the front goes like that, it's like a roller coaster. So yeah, I hear you. So then we'll end on this part because it keeps coming up, and I don't think we'll escape it ever. We're not going to escape this ever. The Chinese and EVs. It's constantly discussed. Well, we're talking about the U.S. Stepping back on government support of EVs. The opposite happened in China over a decade ago. They said, no, we're going to support EVs in a big way and make it our industry. And they have. They're doing great in many markets they enter, taking market share right away, usually due to them being more affordable, all the cost advantages they have. Right now, we're keeping them at bay in the U.S. Do you see that continuing? Do you think or do you even think that's the right thing to do?
Well, I think the writing's on the wall, at least for the next 4 years. I think that politically that our legislation, our government will keep them at bay. But I've been in the auto industry over 30 years, and nobody in the industry can sit still with competition. It's always around the corner, right? It was first European, then the Japanese in the 70s, then the Koreans. And when we look at tremendous growth companies now, it's taken a long time, but Kia, Hyundai, they are doing fantastic. They have great product. They're really starting to resonate. They're winning awards. So it takes time to break into this market, but nobody should write off any market. Right now, China's kept at bay because of some of the political situations, but we should never underestimate competition in this industry. That's one point I wanted to make, but the second point is China is subsidized, and a lot of the companies in China, there's a lot of them, and they're not all profitable.
Correct.
So
yeah.
China has to sort out which of those companies are really going to make it, and then what is the true cost when it gets here if it's not subsidized by the Chinese government. Is the Chinese government going to subsidize for our market?
Right.
And then the other thing is, do we understand if our duty cycle, the American duty cycle, and the quality reputation and reliability and dependability and all those things that are so important that it's taken our American consumer. That's why there is brand loyalty. You get loyal to a brand because you trust them. Yeah. So that takes some time. But I would never underestimate a new player to the industry as an automotive engineer.
No, it's a great point, and if they did come, they'd probably have franchise dealerships. But I think that one of the things that I see of the Chinese discussion is it's assumed that they'll be dirt cheap when they get here. But if you look at BYD prices in other markets for their EVs, they're pretty nice EVs. They're not cheap. they're like a Lexus type price. I mean, the quality looks about the same, but the price isn't very different. So I don't know if a consumer, if they don't see that big price gap, will decide, oh, I'm going to take a leap on a Chinese brand.
Right, right.
So there's a lot to think about with EVs. Elizabeth, thank you so much for being here.
You're
really
welcome.
Appreciate it. Have
My
a great
pleasure.
rest of your show.
Thank you.